The journey of a river begins long before water touches the ground. It starts with the sun warming the oceans and lakes. Heat turns liquid water into vapor through evaporation. The vapor rises into the sky. Plants play their parts too. They release water through their leaves in a process known as transpiration. Together, evaporation and transpiration lift water from the earth into the sky. High above, where the air is thin and cold, water vapor gathers. It cools and condenses into tiny droplets, forming clouds. These clouds drift with the winds until they get too heavy. Then the water falls back to the earth as precipitation: rain, snow, sleet, or hail. When precipitation reaches the ground, it has two choices. Some of it sinks into the soil through the process of infiltration. That water fills the spaces between rocks and grains of soil. It replenishes underground reservoirs. The rest flows over the surface of the land as runoff. This water moves downhill, gathering in small channels that feed into streams and rivers. This endless movement of water from earth to sky and back again, the water cycle, keeps rivers flowing and landscapes changing. Without it, rivers would dry up and life would wither. Water moves downhill because of gravity. It always seeks the lowest point. The steeper the slope, the faster the water flows. This steepness is called the gradient. In places where the land drops sharply, rivers rush with great force. They carve deep valleys and canyons, cutting through rock and soil. The channels are narrow and the water is swift. This fast flow carries rocks and debris, eroding the landscape. Where the land flattens out, the river slows down. The gradient is gentle. The river spreads out and the channels become wider. The water meanders, creating loops and bends. Here the river deposits the sediment it carries, building up rich soils on its banks. A river's path is determined by the path of least resistance. Water flows where it can move most easily. If it encounters hard rock, it might turn aside. If the ground's soft, it'll cut through. The geology of the land, its rocks, faults, and soils help to guide the river's course. Fault lines can create valleys for rivers to follow. Earthquakes and volcanic activity can change the land's shape, altering river paths. The type of rock matters too. Soft rocks like sandstone erode quickly, while hard rocks like granite resist the river's force. Soil composition also affects how much water runs off the land. Sandy soils absorb water, reducing runoff. Clay soils hold water on the surface, increasing runoff and feeding rivers. When building your world, consider these principles. Think about the gradient of the land. In mountainous areas, your rivers will be fast and narrow. In flat plains, they'll be slow and wide. Consider the geology and how these features guide your river's paths. But let's go all the way back to the very beginning. Where do rivers come from? Well, every river has an origin, the headwaters where the river begins to flow. It might start as a trickle from melting snow, a bubbling spring, or the overflow of a lake. These sources are often found in highlands or mountains where gravity pulls the water downward. The steep gradients mean the water moves quickly, carving its way through rock and soil. Clarity of water is a hallmark of headwaters, often untainted by sediments and pollutants that gather downstream. And again, rivers can spring from various origins. You have glacial meltwater. In the cold heights, glaciers hold vast amounts of frozen water. When the sun warms these glaciers, they release meltwater. This water gathers and forms streams that become rivers. The Ganges River, sacred in India, begins from the melting snows of the Himalayas. The Rhone River starts from the Rhone Glacier in the Swiss Alps. Glacial rivers carry fine sediments called glacial flour, giving them a milky appearance. Next, you have springs and seeps. Sometimes rivers emerge from the ground itself. Underground water pushes up to the surface, forming springs and seeps. These sources provide a steady flow as groundwater levels change slowly. The water from springs is often pure, filtered through layers of rock. It maintains a constant temperature year-round, offering a stable environment for life. Or a river may find its source at the outlet of a lake or pond. Water accumulates in these basins until it overflows. The excess water spills out, forming a river that carries the lake's life with it. The flow of these rivers is regulated by the lake's levels. When the rains fill the lake, the river swells. When drought shrinks it, the river wanes. You also have rivers that find their source in rainfall and snowmelt accumulation. In regions where rain is plentiful or snow blankets the land, rivers can form from the direct accumulation of precipitation. Rainwater gathers in small channels, joining together as they flow downhill. In spring, melting snow adds to this flow. These rivers often have a seasonal variation, rushing torrents in the wet season and gentle streams or dry beds in the dry months. Thank you so much for watching so far. If you like the video, like, subscribe below. For those who don't know, I am working on a procedural map generator. Everything I do, all of the research I do, all the work I do on these videos is all done with the goal of advancing that procedural map generator. You can find that map generator at ck2rpg.github.io/generator. You'll also see it on the homepage of my channel here. So with that shameless plug of my free open source project out of the way, let's turn back to rivers. For the remainder of the video, we'll keep some maps generating in the background with the procedural map generator just to give you some ideas of the capabilities of the generator. If you have any questions, comments, please leave them in the comments below. So when we're talking about the source of a river, remember that the source shapes the river's character. A river born of glaciers might carry fine silt and be colder than others. One that starts from a spring could have crystal clear water and a steady flow. A river fed by rain and snow might fluctuate with the seasons, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce. As a river travels its course, it gathers strength not just from its source, but from the many smaller streams that join it along the way. These are the tributaries, lesser rivers that contribute their waters and with them new character and new life to the main river. A tributary is just a smaller stream or river that feeds into a larger one. It doesn't flow directly into the sea, but it instead merges with a main river, adding to that river's volume and altering its path sometimes. Tributaries can come from various places, same as any river: mountain springs, runoff, melting snow, and each brings a unique influence to the river that it joins. Rivers and their tributaries form a vast network, much like the branches of a tree. To understand this complex system, there's a method called stream order classification that recognizes streams based on their hierarchy and connections. The smallest streams, those with no tributaries of their own, are called first-order streams. When two first-order streams meet, they form a second-order stream. When two second-order streams join, they create a third-order stream, and so on. This classification helps to understand the structure of a river system as those tributaries combine and how water flows through it. Each tributary adds its water to the main river, which increases its discharge, that is, the amount of water flowing past a point over time. Tributaries can significantly affect a river's behavior. During heavy rains, they might swell rapidly, contributing to higher flood peaks downstream. They also introduce variability in flow, which can shape a river's course and influence erosion and sediment deposition. Tributaries have effects on the ecosystem of the watershed. They're a pathway for the dispersal of organisms and for genetic diversity. They provide routes for fish and other aquatic organisms to move throughout a watershed. The fish can migrate upstream into smaller waters to spawn or find food, and this movement helps to maintain genetic diversity within species. They also affect the overall river health. Water from tributaries can differ in temperature, mineral content, chemical composition. These variations affect the main river's water quality. A tributary flowing through mineral-rich soils might bring essential nutrients, while one passing through polluted land could introduce contaminants. The mix of waters influences the health of the entire river ecosystem. In building your world, remember that tributaries are these veins feeding the heart of your river. They shape the landscape. Consider where they come from. What do they carry? Do they flow from lush forests, bringing life and richness, or do they come from desolate lands, offering little but the flow of additional water? Think about how they affect the river's volume and behavior. During storms, do they cause the river to swell and flood the lands beyond its banks? In dry seasons, do they dwindle, leaving the main river sluggish and shallow? Tributaries also connect to, obviously, the creatures of your world. They allow fish to journey to distant spawning grounds. They enable plants to spread along the waterways. The health of these smaller streams impacts the entire river system. Now, as rivers journey across the land, of course, Because you have tributaries, there are places where they meet and they merge, and those meeting points are called confluences. Here, the waters from different origins blend into one, altering the character of the river that continues onward. That confluence, again, is just the spot where two or more waterways are coming together. It might be where a small stream joins a larger river, or where two rivers of equal size unite. It could be a gentle mingling or turbulent clash, depending on the nature of the rivers involved. The landscape around a confluence often bears the marks of both waterways, with mixed sediments and varied vegetation. When rivers meet, their combined waters change in ways that affect the flow downstream. The joining of rivers alters the velocity, depth, and turbulence of the water. If a fast-moving river merges with a slower one, the combined flow might speed up or slow down depending on their relative forces. Depth can increase as more water fills the channel, and turbulence might rise where currents collide. Those changes can reshape the riverbanks, carve new paths, or create hazards for navigating the waters. Each river also carries with it its own load of sediments, sand, silt, minerals, and maybe even pollutants. At the confluence, those materials mix. This can lead to changes in the riverbed composition and affect water clarity. Pollutants from one river can spread into the other, impacting water quality downstream. Conversely, the dilution might lessen the concentration of contaminants. Confluences have long been important to human societies. They're natural gathering places where different paths and people intersect. They're sites for trade, cultural exchange, strategic control. Goods can be transported along one river and transferred to another, extending the reach of merchants. Settlements will grow at confluences, becoming hubs where traditions can mingle. Strategically, controlling a confluence means overseeing vital waterways, which can be crucial in times of conflict or for taxation. A notable confluence in our world is where the Missouri River joins the Mississippi River near St. Louis. This meeting forms one of the world's great river systems, draining vast portions of North America. Historically, this confluence was a gateway to the western frontier, and it played a key role in exploration, trade, and expansion. In crafting your world, consider where the rivers meet. These confluences could be centers of activity, places where the natural and human worlds interact. Think about how the merging waters alter the river's character. Does it create a mighty river that cuts through mountains, or does it make it slow and spread into fertile plains? Reflect on the impact of those mixed sediments and water qualities. Maybe one river carries minerals that enrich the soil downstream, fostering agriculture. Maybe another brings pollutants from upstream that creates challenges for those below who rely on the water. Finally, use those confluences as focal points in your world's history and culture. They could be sites of great cities, the cradles of civilization, or the contested grounds for different political structures. We've talked about the headwaters or the origin of a river. We've talked about the tributaries that all flow into a river. We've talked about the confluence, the place where those other waters meet and join together. Now let's talk about the main channel. The main channel is the principal waterway of a river. It carries the bulk of the river's flow, dictating the direction and speed of the water's journey. The channel carves its way through terrain, sometimes gently, sometimes with great force. The shape and size of the main channel aren't fixed. They change over time due to erosion, the deposition of sediment, and the rate of the river's flow. Fast-moving water erodes the riverbed and banks, deepening and widening the channel. When the flow slows, sediment settles, altering the channel's depth and shape. Now, several factors influence a channel's morphology. There's the geology of the land, the rock types, and the soil composition that affect how easily the river can cut through its bed and banks. Vegetation along the riverbanks can slow erosion by holding the soil together with roots. Human activities like building dams, levees, or altering a river's course can significantly change the channel's shape and flow. Now, a river's flow is fastest in the center of the main channel and it slows near the banks due to friction with the riverbed and obstacles. This difference in speed creates a velocity profile across the channel. The faster center flow can carry more sediment and has more energy to erode the riverbed. In some stretches, the river flows smoothly in parallel layers. That's called laminar flow. It's quiet and orderly, causes minimal erosion. In other areas, the flow is turbulent, it's chaotic, it's got swirling eddies and currents. This turbulent flow increases the river's ability to erode its banks and bed and reshape the main channel. When designing rivers in your world, think about the main channel as the backbone of the river. Its shape, its size, and flow influence everything from the landscape to the communities that settle on it. Think about how erosion, sediment, and flow rates shape that channel over time. Reflect on factors that might alter its course, the rocks that it's cutting through, the plants that line its banks, or even man-made factors. Now, moving outward from the main channel, you have the river banks. The river's edge is where the water meets the land. It's made up of soil, rock, and vegetation. That soil might be rich and dark or sandy and loose, depending on the land it comes from. Rocks of all sizes can be found along the banks, from small pebbles to large boulders. These stones can strengthen the bank and resist that pull of the water. Vegetation also plays a crucial role here. You have grasses, shrubs, and trees that grow along banks. Their roots dig deep into the soil, and these roots hold the earth together, giving stability to a riverbank. Without them, you'd have soil washing away more easily, and the banks would crumble. Now, that stability of a riverbank depends on its makeup. Banks with strong roots or solid rocks stand firm against a river's flow. Those made of loose soil without vegetation, you're much more likely to see erosion. And speaking of erosion, the river is always moving, and with that movement comes change. On the outside bends of a river, the water flows faster. That speed undercuts the bank and wears away the soil and rock. Over time, this erosion can cause the bank to collapse, which can change the shape of a river. On the inside bends, the water moves more slowly. Here, the river drops the sediment it carries, sand, silt, small stones, and this deposition builds up the bank and creates new land and alters the river's course. These processes of erosion and deposition are natural. They shape the river banks, they create habitats for wildlife, and they can change the landscape over time. Human interaction, of course, can also affect the river banks. People often live by rivers because rivers provide water, food, and means of travel. But agriculture and urban development can weaken the riverbanks. Clearing land for crops or buildings often involves removing vegetation. Without the roots to hold the soil, the banks become more unstable and more prone to erosion. Or similarly, paving over land in our world increases runoff, which can lead to higher water levels and stronger currents that erode banks. When building your world and designing a river, consider what the banks are made of: soil that crumbles or rocks that stand firm. Imagine the plants that grow there and how the roots hold the land together. Reflect on how the river shapes its banks through erosion and deposition. Maybe it carves away at one side, forming cliffs while building up sandbars on the other. These changes can alter the course of the river, affect where people can build, and create new habitats for animals. Consider how people in your world interact with the riverbanks. Are they farming the fertile land nearby? Have they built towns that need protection from floods? What measures have they taken to stabilize the banks? And how do those actions affect the river and the life around it? For example, to combat erosion, maybe they've developed methods to stabilize banks through riprapping, layers of large rocks placed along the bank to absorb the force of the water, or retaining walls made of wood, stone, or concrete that can hold a bank in place. Or maybe they naturally stabilize the banks through revegetation or planting, restoring those natural roots that bind the soil. Now, continuing with the anatomy of a river and moving outward from the river banks, you have the floodplain. Floodplain is a wide, flat land that stretches out beside a river. It's the river's own creation, formed over years of floods and the deposits that they leave behind. When a river swells and overflows its banks, it spreads silt and sediment across adjacent land. As the waters recede, these materials settle, enriching the soil and slowly building up the terrain. And that process repeats with each flood, shaping a landscape that's more fertile. Again, the floodplain is just that flat area next to the river created by the sediments deposited during floods. Over time, silt and sand accumulating, forming a broad level expanse along the river's course. The soils of a floodplain are rich with nutrients brought down by the river. This makes them ideal for farming. Crops grow strong and plentiful on fertile ground. For centuries, people have settled on floodplains to take advantage of the productive land. The natural replenishment of nutrients means less need for artificial fertilizers and sustains agriculture over a longer period of time. Floodplains are alive with a diversity of plants and animals. The mix of water, fertile soil, and varied habitats creates a haven for wildlife. Wetlands, grasslands, and forests can all be found here, supporting creatures from fish and amphibians to birds and mammals. Seasonal floods create new habitats and breeding grounds and foster biodiversity. Now, the floodplain acts as a natural sponge. It absorbs excess water during floods. This reduces the height and speed of floodwaters downstream, and it lessens the impact on other areas. By spreading out water over a wide area, a floodplain diminishes the force of the flood and protects both the land and the communities that might lie further along the river's path. In your world building, think about how humans might react to floodplain areas. Have they built levees to protect their homes, not realizing the downstream consequences? Have they drained the wetlands only to find the soil less fertile over time? Do they work with the natural cycles, planting crops that can withstand floods, building on higher ground, or preserving habitats that make the floodplain unique? Continuing with the anatomy of a river, you have meanders. Meanders form through simple but powerful forces, erosion and deposition. On the outer banks of a bend, again, the water flows faster. That speed gives it the strength to erode the soil and rock, wearing away the land bit by bit. On the inner banks, the water moves more slowly, and again, here it loses the energy to carry sediment, which settles and accumulates. This process builds up the inner bank. The combination of erosion on the outer side and deposition on the inner side exaggerates the bends, making the meanders more and more pronounced over time. And they're not fixed, they're ever changing features. Over time, meanders gradually shift downstream. This continual erosion of the outer banks and deposition on the inner banks causes those bends to move, and the river effectively pushes its meanders along, reshaping valleys as it goes. Now, sometimes a meander grows so extreme that it forms a tight loop. During a flood or a period of high flow, the river might break through a narrow neck of land at the base of the loop, and this creates a new, straighter channel. The abandoned loop becomes an oxbow lake, which is a crescent-shaped body of still water separated from the flowing river. These oxbow lakes can become unique habitats rich in wildlife. Now, meanders affect river length and gradient. They make a river longer than it would be if it flowed straight, and that increased length reduces the river's gradient, that slope from its source to its mouth. A gentler gradient means the river flow slows down, and that slower flow encourages more deposition on inner banks and further erosion on outer banks, enhancing the meandering process. It's a cycle that continues as long as the river runs its course. So when you look at a meandering river in your world, see it as almost a living thing. Its curves and bends aren't random, they're the result of natural forces at work. The meanders will create fertile lands on their inner banks where sediments are rich and deep, which is ideal for farming communities. The outer banks might be higher ground, maybe cliffs or bluffs shaped by the river's persistent erosion. And consider how that shifting meander affects the people and the creatures that live nearby. Villages might need to move over time as the river changes course. Oxbow lakes could become sacred sites or havens for wildlife, and a meandering river will add that character to the landscape. Uh, Continuing with the anatomy of a river, beneath the flowing water lies the riverbed. That's the foundation on which the river moves. The riverbed's makeup varies from place to place. In some stretches, it's solid bedrock. Elsewhere, it's covered with gravel, sand, or fine silt. And these materials come from the erosion of rocks and soils upstream. The river carries these particles, depositing them along its course. The composition of the riverbed affects how the river flows, how it erodes its banks, and how it supports life. It's not flat or uniform. It's shaped by the movement of water and sediment, creating features known as bed forms. Bed forms, you have things like ripples and dunes. In areas where the river flows gently, small ridges, called ripples, form on the sandy bed. They're like patterns you see on a beach when the tide goes out. Where the water moves faster, these ripples grow into dunes. Those are those larger mounds of sand that are shaped by the current. You also have anti-dunes. Under certain conditions, when water flows very swiftly or supercritically, anti-dunes can form. And these are like dunes, but they move upstream instead of downstream. Now, a riverbed is shaped by three main processes: erosion, transport, and deposition. The river picks up material from its bed and banks. Fast-moving water can lift particles from the bed, wearing it down over time, and this erosion changes the shape of the riverbed and provides the sediment that the river is carrying. Once that sediment is in the water, the river transports it downstream. Larger particles roll or bounce along the bottom, called bed load transport, and finer particles might be suspended in the water or carried along until the river slows down. When the river loses energy, it drops the sediment it's carrying, and this deposition builds up the riverbed in places, forming bars and islands. It can fill in channels, forcing the river to find a new path. These processes are constant. They shape the riverbed and influence a river's course and affect how the river interacts with the land. Now, riverbeds teem with aquatic life. Creatures that live on the riverbed are called benthic organisms. They include insects, worms, snails, tiny crustaceans, and these organisms are vital to the river's ecosystem because they break down organic matter, recycle nutrients, and provide food for larger animals like fish. Many fish rely on specific riverbed conditions for spawning. Salmon, for example, need clean, well-oxygenated gravel beds to lay their eggs. If a riverbed is clogged with fine silt due to excessive erosion upstream, it can smother the eggs and reduce fish populations. The composition and health of the riverbed thus directly impacts the life cycle of these species. So in your world, think about what lies beneath your rivers. Is the bed rocky, forcing the water to rush and tumble? Is it sandy and smooth, allowing the river to glide quietly? Consider how sediment moves through the rivers. Erosion upstream leading to deposition downstream, altering landscapes, affecting communities. And think about the life that depends on the riverbed and the healthy communities that can support entire aquatic ecosystems. Continuing with the anatomy of a river, as you walk along a river, you'll notice that it's not the same everywhere. There are places where the water deepens and slows, and others where it shallows and quickens. These features are known as pools and riffles. They give the river a little bit of rhythm. Pools are the deepest part of a river, and those are where the water moves slowly. They often form on outside bends where the river has eroded the bank and carved out a deeper channel. The calm waters of a pool provide a refuge for fish and other aquatic creatures. Riffles are shallow sections where the water flows swiftly over rocks and gravels. You'll find them between pools, creating an alternating pattern along the river's course. The fast-moving water tumbles and churns, breaking over stones and creating that familiar sound of a running stream. Pools and riffles form through natural actions of erosion and deposition. As the river flows, it erodes material from its banks and bed, especially on the outside bends where the water moves fastest, and that creates those deeper pools. On the inside of bends where the water slows down, that sediment's deposited, forming those shallower areas. And over time, this process creates that alternating sequence. These play an ecological role. The presence of pools and riffles creates a variety of habitats within the river. Different species thrive in those varying conditions. Fish like trout and salmon often rest in the deeper, calmer pools. Insects and other small creatures might prefer those oxygen-rich riffles. Riffles also play a crucial role in adding oxygen to the water. As water rushes over rocks and drops, it mixes with the air, increasing its oxygen content. So when you map the rivers in your world, consider the interplay of these pools and riffles. Pools might be places where fishermen gather or where creatures rest, and the riffles could be challenging spots for boats, but still essential for the life of the river. Continuing with the anatomy of the river, you have rapids. Rapids form where a river's gradient changes suddenly. The water speeds up as it moves over rocks and boulders. Obstacles like fallen trees or large stones disrupt the flow, causing the water to churn and crash. These sudden changes can make the river turbulent and fast, creating challenging sections that test those who navigate the waters. Next, you have waterfalls. Waterfalls occur where hard rock layers sit above softer ones. The softer rock erodes more quickly, undercutting the hard rock. Eventually, the hard rock can no longer hold back the water and it plunges over the edge. The constant flow of water wears away that softer rock below, slowly moving the waterfall upstream. Each drop of water steadily adds to that erosion and shapes the landscape. Now, rapids and waterfalls have impacts on river continuity. They serve as natural barriers in the river. They make navigation difficult, stopping boats and ships from moving freely upstream or downstream. For fish and other aquatic life, these obstacles can block migration routes. Species have to find ways around or above these barriers to move along the river, affecting life cycles in the ecosystem. So when designing rivers in your world, consider where those rapids and waterfalls might appear, where they might break the river's flow and add character to the landscape. Think about how that will affect travel and the movement of species. Continuing with the anatomy of a river, you have estuaries and river mouths. At the end of a river's journey, where fresh water meets the vast sea, is that place of transition. These areas are known as estuaries and river mouths. They're vital zones where land and ocean blend and create unique environments. So, the estuary is where the river flows into the sea. It creates a mix of fresh and salt water. It's a dynamic zone where tides and river currents meet and they shape the landscape. The river mouth is the point where the river empties into the ocean, marking the end of the river's journey. Together, estuaries and river mouths are constantly changing, influenced by both the land and the sea. In an estuary, fresh water from the river and salt water from the ocean mingle. That creates a salinity gradient, a gradual change in salt concentration from the river's source to the sea. Near the river, the water's fresh and low in salt, and as you move toward the sea, the water becomes saltier and more brackish. That gradient affects the type of plants and animals that can thrive in these different parts of the estuary. Some species might be adapted to the low salinity, while others would thrive where the salt water is stronger. The mixing can create diverse habitats, each with unique conditions. Estuaries and river mouths are among the most productive ecosystems on Earth. They support thriving fisheries, provide breeding and feeding grounds for many fish species. The rich nutrients brought by the river sustain populations of plants and animals. These areas are critical for migratory birds. They offer rest and food during their long journeys. Spawning fish rely on those sheltered waters of estuaries to lay their eggs. The high productivity of these zones makes them essential for both wildlife and human communities. When designing your world, consider the role of estuaries and river mouths. These areas are not just endpoints for rivers, but they're usually vibrant regions where that land and sea interaction occurs. Think about how the salinity gradient shapes the life that lives there. Picture fisheries along the coast. Picture flocks of migratory birds that rely on these habitats. If it's not become clear by now, when designing a river, it is important to look at the longitudinal profile of a river, how the river changes from its upper reaches to its lower stretches. In an upper course, the river will likely begin high in the mountains or hills, where the slopes are steep and the river is flowing quickly. It's cutting deep, forming narrow V-shaped valleys. Water here has a lot of energy, carving through rock, carrying large stones, and this part of the river can be rugged and wild. At the middle course, as the river moves into it, the slopes can become more moderate. Valleys widen, the river starts to meander or curve. The water slows down a bit, allowing smaller sediments to settle. The river becomes wider and deeper with gentle bends. The landscape here is less steep, and the river begins to shape that broader valley. Finally, in the lower course, the river reaches flatter land. The slopes are gentle. The river spreads out over a wide floodplain. Deposition dominates here. The river flows slowly, meanders more extensively, and sometimes forms things like oxbow lakes, right, where those loops are cut off. The land around the river becomes more fertile and supports more rich ecosystems and human agriculture. When you design rivers in your world, think of that river profile. Think of the upper course, the middle course, the lower course, and how it changes at each stage. Thanks for watching. I encourage you to check out the procedural map generator and drop a comment below with any features you'd like to see me add to the generator.